They called me Barren and sold me for $200. But the rancher said he didn't want children anyway. The auction block creaked under the weight of June's shame. She stood there, head down, her heart pounding as the men crowded around, sizing her up like cattle. She could feel their eyes scanning every inch of her, judging her worth. The whispers began, barren, worthless. The words stung, but she had grown used to them over the years. The truth was, June knew she would never be what they wanted. She would never give them what they expected. Her family had turned away. They didn't even look back. She had no future in their eyes. No children, no heirs. She wasn't a woman to be cherished, not like the others. As the auctioneer called for bids, June tried not to cry. She had nowhere else to go. Then a man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that seemed older than his years. Garrett Merritt. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned her with a calmness that unsettled her more than the men's leering stares. $200, he said simply. The auctioneer's gavel hit, and just like that, June was his. She couldn't understand why he'd wanted her, a barren woman, no better than a servant. But Garrett simply took her by the arm, led her away, and never looked back. Why would he want a barren woman like her? The ride to the ranch was long and silent. The sun beat down on them, and June could hear the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves against the dirt road. She stared out at the barren landscape, her mind racing with questions, but none of them had answers. The silence between her and Garrett was thick. He didn't speak, and she didn't dare to break the stillness. With every bump of the wagon, June's nerves grew more taut. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know who he was or why he had chosen her. She had expected to be used, to be dismissed just like the others had done. She had expected him to be just like all the others, the ones who had looked at her and seen nothing but a problem, a woman who couldn't give them what they wanted. But Garrett didn't treat her that way. He didn't talk to her, but he didn't dismiss her either. She caught glimpses of his face, but he never made eye contact. There was no judgment there, no condemnation. And for some strange reason, that terrified her even more. The ranch finally came into view. It was a beautiful house, large, with wide, welcoming porches. But it felt cold, somehow. Empty. The trees were bare, the fences in need of repair, and the house itself stood like a forgotten monument to some tragedy. June couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this place had witnessed something dark. "You'll be staying upstairs," Garrett said, breaking the silence as the wagon came to a stop. "Supper's at 6. That was it. No explanation, no comfort. Just an invitation to join him for a meal, as though she were a servant, not a wife. The house was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. June wandered through the quiet rooms, feeling the weight of the house's history pressing down on her. In the parlor, a large portrait of a woman hung over the fireplace. Caroline. She was beautiful, refined, elegant. And there were 2 young girls in the portrait with her. Twin daughters, their bright eyes full of life. But the house held no life now. She moved through the hall, finding a locked door at the end of the corridor. The children's room. The door was locked, but she could feel the presence of the room, the emptiness. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to them. Why were the rooms untouched? Why had they been locked away? Later, at dinner, she sat alone at the small table. The chair creaked as she shifted her weight, trying to get comfortable in the unfamiliar silence. Garrett ate in silence too, his eyes never meeting hers. He didn't explain, didn't apologize for the awkwardness. He simply ate his meal and left without a word. She finished her own meal, the food tasteless in her mouth. The house was empty, and she was just another ghost drifting through it. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the family who had lived here. What had happened to the woman in the portrait? And why was she here now? The next morning, June found herself in a new room, a new life. The soft rays of morning sunlight slipped through the curtains, but they didn't offer any warmth. She got dressed quietly, trying not to make a sound, but the stillness of the house was suffocating. When she entered the kitchen, Garrett was already there. He was sitting at the table, a piece of toast in his hand. He didn't look up when she entered, but his voice was steady. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for a wife. I'm asking for a companion. My family expects me to remarry. I can't do that again. I can't pretend with someone else." June stared at him, unsure what to say. His words didn't make sense. He didn't want a wife. He didn't want children. Why then had he bought her? "This is an arrangement," he continued, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. "You need a home, and I need peace. We'll live together, but not as a family. Not as anything but two people sharing space." The words didn't sink in right away. She didn't know what he wanted from her. What kind of peace did he expect? What kind of life was he offering her? It was a strange, hollow arrangement, one that felt like a transaction rather than a marriage. But something in his eyes told her there was more he wasn't saying. There was a reason behind his words, and she would have to uncover it piece by piece. The chapter closed with June standing in the silence, still unsure of her place in this new life, but sensing that the house, the ranch, and Garrett himself held secrets she was only beginning to discover. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet, unspoken moments. June settled into a routine, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and trying her best to stay out of Garrett's way. He worked from dawn until dusk, barely speaking to her, his presence always felt but never acknowledged. She had expected the silence, the emptiness, but as the days passed, she began to notice the small gestures he made. Each morning, a steaming cup of coffee would appear outside her door, always at the same time. Her worn shoes were cleaned and returned, as though he knew the discomfort they caused her. She found a jar of wildflowers on the breakfast table one morning, and the mare she had noticed staring at her from the barn was saddled and waiting outside her window. She never asked why, nor did he offer an explanation. It was as if the gifts spoke a silent language that only the two of them understood. At first, she hesitated, unsure she should accept them, but soon she found herself leaving little things in return: a mended shirt, wrapped biscuits, a bouquet of wildflowers. They never spoke of it. It became their unspoken agreement, their quiet connection that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, after dinner, as she sat in the garden, she found a small book of poetry left on her nightstand, worn and annotated in Garrett's handwriting. She ran her fingers over the underlined words. "We love the things we love for what they are." The line stuck with her, and she realized that these small acts of kindness, the silent gifts, were Garrett's way of showing her something deeper than mere politeness. They weren't just acts of duty or pity. They were his way of saying he saw her, of telling her, without words, that she was beginning to matter. But despite this unspoken bond, the weight of the house, the memories of his lost family, still hung heavily in the air, like a shadow that neither of them dared to confront. One night, as she checked on the mare in the barn, she found Garrett alone, his shirt off, sweat glistening on his back. She froze, unable to hide the shock that registered on her face when she saw the extensive burn scars crisscrossing his shoulders. Garrett's defensive movement as he reached for his shirt was swift, but the moment of vulnerability didn't escape her. In that fleeting second, the walls he had carefully built around himself began to crack. He turned to her, his voice low but steady as he told her the story of the barn fire that had stolen his wife and daughters from him. How he had been away buying cattle when the fire broke out. How he had tried to save them, but was too late. He explained how Victoria, his fiancée, had abandoned him after seeing his scars, and how the humiliation had driven him to a life of solitude. "I can't be a father again," he confessed, his voice breaking for the first time. "I won't risk that pain." June could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of his grief, and for the first time, she didn't see him as just a man who had bought her, but as a man broken by loss. She stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his scarred shoulder. "You're not broken," she whispered, "just changed." It was in that moment, As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, that June began to understand the depth of the man she was living with. And though the truth of his past was painful, she knew that it was a truth that bound them together, not as strangers, but as two souls who had both been scarred by life, yet still managed to find something real in each other. Yet, as much as they had come to understand each other in silence, the tension between them was far from gone, and the past was waiting to resurface when they least expected it. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they had something worth fighting for. The days following the revelation of Garrett's painful past were filled with a quiet intensity that neither of them could deny. June began to see Garrett not as the cold, distant rancher she had first met, but as a man who had suffered deeply and had never allowed anyone close enough to heal. The walls between them were slowly beginning to crumble, but they were still guarded, unsure of how to proceed. They spent more time together in the mornings, sharing quiet moments over coffee on the porch, and in the evenings, they would take walks by the creek, the sound of the water flowing soothing their troubled minds. June found herself feeling at home in ways she never had before. She had expected to feel like an outsider, unwanted, but here, with Garrett, she was starting to feel as though she belonged. One evening, after a long day of work, June was sitting on the porch, absent-mindedly running her fingers over the rough surface of the wood. She heard Garrett approach and turned to face him. He looked different, more open, more vulnerable than he had in days past. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that had not been there before. He sat down beside her, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that was both hesitant and longing. "June," he began, his voice low and steady. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been holding on to for a long time." June's heart began to race as she looked at him, sensing the weight of his words. She didn't know what he was about to say, but she felt as though this moment would change everything. "I've been carrying the guilt of losing Caroline and the girls for 5 years," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't there when they needed me. I couldn't save them. And because of that, I promised myself I would never risk being a father again. I told myself that I didn't want children, that I didn't need anyone else to take their place." June listened intently, her heart breaking for the man sitting beside her. She had always known there was pain behind his silence, but hearing the truth of his loss made her realize just how deep that pain ran. "But when I saw you," Garrett continued, his gaze fixed on the ground, "I didn't see a woman who was trying to replace anyone. I saw a woman who had been through her own battles, who had suffered in her own way, and yet she was still standing. I saw you as a person, not as a solution to my grief. And that's why I chose you. I chose you because you were real, because you didn't try to be anyone else." June's breath caught in her throat as his words sunk in. He wasn't asking her to be something she wasn't. He wasn't expecting her to heal him, to fix his past. He was simply telling her that she was enough. She had never felt like enough in her life. Not for her family, not for the men who had looked at her and seen only disappointment. But here, with Garrett, she was starting to believe that maybe she had been enough all along. She reached out and placed her hand over his, the gesture simple but meaningful. "I'm not broken," she whispered. "I just needed to be seen." Garrett's eyes softened as he looked at her, his thumb brushing gently over the back of her hand. "You're not broken, June. Not anymore." The air between them shifted, and for the first time, the distance that had separated them seemed to fade away. The unspoken tension between them had been replaced by a quiet understanding, a connection that neither of them had expected, but both of them had been craving. It was a slow burn, a gradual realization that what they had could be something more than just an arrangement. But even as they sat there, the stars beginning to twinkle in the evening sky, June couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't finished with them yet. The next morning, June woke early, the sun just beginning to rise. She found herself outside in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds, her mind racing with everything that had been said the night before. She had never thought of herself as someone who could belong anywhere. And yet, in this house, on this ranch, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a place. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, feeling like she was always on the outside looking in. But now, with Garrett, she felt as though she was finally being seen. As she worked in the garden, Garrett came out to join her, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. He didn't speak at first, but she could feel his presence beside her, a quiet support that she had grown to rely on. He picked up a hoe and began to help her with the weeds, their movements in sync, as though they had done this for years. "You've been working hard," he said after a few moments, his voice low but warm. "I can see the difference." June smiled, feeling a sense of pride in the garden she had created. "I've always wanted to grow something," she replied, wiping her brow. "It feels good to finally see it take root." "Just like us," Garrett said, his voice soft but full of meaning. June looked at him, a spark of understanding passing between them. They were both growing, both healing, and both learning to trust in something that they had never thought possible. As the days passed, their connection deepened. They spent more time together, talking about their pasts, their dreams, and the future they both longed for. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Garrett turned to June, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before: vulnerability, hope, and the faintest trace of longing. He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and for a moment, their faces were inches apart. He leaned in slowly, as if he was testing the waters, but before their lips could meet, he pulled back, a mixture of regret and fear in his eyes. "I can't offer you what you deserve," he murmured, his voice strained. June's heart ached as she looked at him. She knew the pain he carried, but she also knew that he had given her something more valuable than anything she could have asked for: his trust. "What if you already are?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The moment hung in the air between them, a delicate tension that neither of them was willing to break. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, and then, with a soft sigh, he kissed her. It was slow and gentle, a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through and everything that was still to come. The past was still there, lingering in the corners of their minds, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was the future they were beginning to build together. But even as their hearts began to open to each other, the shadows of the past remained, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a battle they would have to face together, and June wasn't sure if they were ready for it. But one thing was certain: they were stronger than they had been when they first met, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The storm was coming, but they would weather it side by side. The days following their quiet moments together seemed to pass in a blur. June had finally begun to believe in the possibility of a life here, a life where she wasn't just an afterthought or a mistake. Garrett had shown her more kindness than she had ever expected, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace. They spent their days working side by side, Garrett teaching her about ranch life, about cattle and land, while she tended to the house and garden. It was a rhythm they had fallen into naturally, and the warmth that had been absent from the house was slowly returning. But as much as June wanted to believe that they had left the past behind, the town had other plans. Market day arrived, and with it, the reality of being the new Mrs. Merritt. June had hoped for a quiet trip into town, just a quick errand for supplies, nothing more. But as soon as the wagon pulled into Graston, the whispers began. It didn't take long for the women at the market to notice her. They stared, their eyes narrowing as they judged her, their whispers loud enough for her to hear. "She's the one, isn't she? The one who wasn't wanted by anyone else." June kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but the words cut through her like a blade. She had expected the judgment. She had always been a subject of it, but it didn't make it any easier. At the general store, a woman named Beatrice, who had been Caroline's close friend, approached her with a cold smile. "So, you're the one who has taken Caroline's place?" Beatrice asked, her tone sharp and dismissive. June tried to muster a smile, but it felt forced. "I'm not trying to replace anyone," she replied quietly. Beatrice's eyes glinted with a mix of curiosity and judgment, and she didn't bother to hide her disdain. "You think you could just walk into her life and take over?" Beatrice's words stung, but before June could respond, Garrett appeared at her side, his presence like a shield. "She's exactly what was expected," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. Beatrice shot him a look of surprise, but she didn't argue. Garrett paid for their supplies quickly, his eyes never leaving June's face, as if to reassure her that she wasn't alone in this. The ride home was silent, the weight of the encounter heavy on June's chest. As the wagon bumped along the dirt road, she let out a small, nervous laugh. "I never expected to be so talked about." Garrett glanced over at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "They'll get used to you," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I hope so," she murmured, her mind swirling with doubt. "But sometimes I wonder if they'll ever truly accept me." "They will," Garrett replied. "Give them time." But as they pulled up to the ranch, June couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be that simple. The next few days were filled with an awkward tension. June spent most of her time in the garden, trying to forget the whispers, but every time she went into town, the cold stares followed her. It wasn't just the women at the market. Even the men seemed to eye her with curiosity and judgment. The whole town had been watching, and they had already made up their minds about her. But it wasn't just the townspeople who were making things difficult. That night, after a quiet dinner, Garrett's brother Preston arrived at the ranch unexpectedly. Preston was everything Garrett wasn't: polished, confident, and with a sharp tongue that never seemed to have a filter. He eyed June with a critical gaze as he sat down at the table, and the awkwardness between them was immediate. "So," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension, "how are things here? Settling in, I hope?" June nodded, unsure what to say. She didn't feel comfortable in Preston's presence. There was something about him that made her feel small, like she didn't belong. "I'm fine," she said simply, but Preston wasn't interested in small talk. "I hear you've been working hard," he continued, his eyes scanning her. "Well, don't get too comfortable. I hope you're aware that you have 1 year to provide an heir. After that, Garrett and I will have to discuss the next steps." June's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Preston's gaze didn't waver. "It's simple, really. If you don't produce a child, you and Garrett's little arrangement will be over." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had never been more aware of her own worthlessness than she was in that moment. She had never been able to give anyone what they wanted, and now she was being told that she was nothing more than a tool to produce an heir. "Preston," Garrett's voice cut through the tension, sharp and firm. "That's enough. I'm just stating the facts." Preston replied with a shrug. "The estate can't be left without heirs. If you're going to inherit it, you need someone who can carry on the family name." Garrett's eyes darkened, and he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You'll keep your opinions to yourself, Preston," he said, his voice low with authority. Preston didn't back down, but he could tell that he had pushed Garrett to his limit. The two men stared each other down, the tension palpable in the room. June sat there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. The weight of Preston's words hung over her like a dark cloud, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she felt completely helpless. Later that evening, as June stood in the garden, trying to clear her mind, she saw Garrett approach. He looked at her, his face troubled, and then turned his gaze away, as if unsure of what to say. "I didn't mean for you to hear that," he said finally. June didn't look at him. She couldn't. The words Preston had spoken were like a knife in her chest. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. "I'm just a tool to you, aren't I? Someone to provide an heir, someone to keep the ranch going." Garrett's face twisted in disbelief. "No," he said quickly, his voice desperate. "That's not what I meant. I never saw you that way. You're not just a means to an end, June. You're. He trailed off, as though searching for the right words. She turned to face him then, her eyes full of confusion and pain. What am I to you, Garrett? She asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated and then stepped closer, taking her hands in his. You're everything to me, he said, his voice low but full of emotion. I never wanted anyone else. I never asked for this life, for this family, but when I saw you, I knew. I knew you were the one I was meant to be with. His words hit her like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly smothered by the weight of everything that was happening around them. The past wasn't done with them yet, and as much as they had grown closer, they were about to face a test that neither of them was prepared for. That night, as June lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. The weight of Preston's words and the uncertainty that came with them kept her awake. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let the past define her. She couldn't let Preston or anyone else dictate her future. She was stronger than that, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel less than she was. 2 weeks passed, and the tension at the ranch only grew. June tried to push the weight of Preston's ultimatum from her mind, but it clung to her like a heavy cloak. Every time she stepped outside, every time she saw Garrett, she felt its presence looming over them both. She had become increasingly aware of how much her life had shifted in such a short time, from the empty house that had felt like a prison to the strange connection she was building with Garrett. But now, everything seemed at risk. The quiet days of working side by side, of learning from each other, seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality that their arrangement, their fragile peace, was now on the line. Garrett had told her time and time again that she didn't owe him anything, that their connection wasn't based on producing an heir, but she couldn't ignore the cold reality of Preston's words. Preston had made it clear that, in his eyes, she wasn't enough unless she could fulfill that role. The constant pressure of being judged by the people in town, especially by Preston, made June feel more isolated than ever. As much as Garrett had stood by her, the weight of his family's expectations was too much for one man to bear alone. It wasn't long before June found herself in the midst of an emotional battle. One morning, as she stood at the kitchen sink, looking out at the wide expanse of land before her, she felt a sharp, familiar pang in her chest, a feeling of deep-rooted insecurity that she had carried for years. The feeling of being overlooked, of not being enough, crept up on her in a way she couldn't ignore. And it was then that she realized that her fears had never truly left her. It wasn't just about what Preston had said. It was about her own sense of self-worth, her own fear of never being enough for anyone, least of all Garrett. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm glow over the ranch, Garrett entered the house after a long day of work, his face drawn with exhaustion. He didn't notice June standing by the window, her back to him, but he sensed the change in her demeanor immediately. He could feel the tension between them, the unease that had settled into her bones. He walked up to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and she flinched. He frowned, stepping back. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She turned to face him, her heart racing. For the first time in weeks, she felt that emotional wall between them, a wall that had started to rebuild itself, brick by brick. "I'm not enough," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of her own doubt. "I don't think I ever will be." The words hung heavy in the air between them, and for a long moment, Garrett didn't know what to say. The truth was, he had known this was coming, had known that the pressure would eventually get to her. But hearing her say it out loud, seeing the pain in her eyes, made him feel like he had failed her in ways he didn't know how to fix. "June, that's not true," he said gently, his voice steady but full of concern. "You're everything to me, more than enough." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know what you see in me, Garrett. I don't know why you chose me. I'm not like the women you're used to. I can't give you what they can give you. I'm barren. I'm broken. The words spilled out of her like a flood, each one heavier than the last. And as they left her lips, she felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. But that weight was replaced by something darker, something that made her feel even smaller, even more invisible. Garrett's expression softened, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek. "You're not broken," he said firmly, his voice low and full of conviction. "You're not barren. You're everything I've been searching for." He paused, his thumb brushing against her skin. "I didn't choose you because I thought you could give me an heir. I chose you because I saw something in you, something real, something that no one else could offer." He took a step back, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "I don't need anyone else, June. I don't need a perfect woman. I don't need someone who fits into some mold. I just need you." But as his words settled in the room, June couldn't shake the doubt that had taken root in her heart. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she was enough, that their connection was enough to withstand the pressures they faced. But with every passing day, the weight of Preston's ultimatum and the cruel whispers of the townspeople made it harder to ignore the fear gnawing at her insides. She wanted to be the woman Garrett saw, the one who could stand by his side and be everything he needed, but she was afraid that she wasn't. She was afraid that she would never be able to live up to the expectations that had been placed on her. That evening, as June sat alone in the garden, her thoughts swirling, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. She stood up, wiping her tears away, and saw Garrett riding toward her on his horse. He had been gone most of the day, checking on the cattle, but now, as the sun began to set, he was back. He dismounted and walked toward her, his eyes searching her face. "June," he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness she hadn't heard before. "I need you to listen to me." She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "I'm listening." Garrett stepped closer, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "I know you're scared. I know you think you're not enough. But I'm here to tell you, you are more than enough. And I'm not going anywhere." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "I won't let anyone take you away from me. I won't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here. This is your home, and you're my family, the family I've been waiting for." June felt her heart swell with emotion, and for the first time in weeks, the wall she had built around herself began to crumble. She looked at Garrett, her eyes searching his face for the truth she had been afraid to see. And when she found it, she knew, deep down, that he meant every word. "I'm scared, Garrett," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared that I'm not strong enough to handle all of this. The pressure, the expectations, the fear that I'll never be enough for you." Garrett's hand cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. "You are strong enough," he said softly, "and you don't have to carry this alone. I'm here, and I'll always be here. We'll face whatever comes together." It was in that moment that June realized something profound. She had spent so much of her life trying to be what everyone else wanted her to be. But here, with Garrett, she didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to fit into some ideal. All she had to do was be herself. And that, she realized, was enough. But even as the weight of her own insecurities began to lift, the battle wasn't over. Preston's threats still hung over them like a dark cloud, and the court date was fast approaching. Garrett had promised her that he wouldn't let anyone take her away, but June knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to face, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. She had Garrett by her side, and together, they would face whatever came their way. They were stronger than they had been when they first met, and they would be stronger still when the storm passed. And no matter what, she knew she was enough for him, for herself, and for the life they were beginning to build together. As June and Garrett faced the challenges of the impending court date, the weight of their situation grew heavier by the day. The harsh judgment of the town, the pressure from Preston, and the looming threat of annulment weighed on both of them. But despite everything, They found themselves clinging to the quiet moments of peace they had built together. Each day, June learned more about herself, about the strength she had kept hidden for so long, and the power of having someone who truly saw her for who she was. Yet, the constant reminder of the world outside their home, the whispers, the cold stares, the expectations placed upon her, continued to loom over her like an ever-present shadow. She had always feared that she would never be enough, that she would always be the one overlooked, the one left behind. But Garrett had shown her something different, something she hadn't expected. He had shown her that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved, that she didn't have to fit a mold to be worthy of love and belonging. Still, with Preston's threat hanging over them, June couldn't shake the fear that the world might never accept her. The court case loomed, and she could feel the tension building as the days ticked down. They were fighting not just for their home, but for their future. It was a battle that felt as much about their love as it was about proving her worth to a world that had never truly cared for her. And yet, through it all, June had found something stronger than fear: hope. That hope had begun in the quiet moments between her and Garrett, in the simple, honest conversations that had slowly peeled away the layers of their pain and allowed them to begin healing. They had faced their own demons, their own fears, and had found comfort in each other. And now, with the court date fast approaching, they knew that the fight was not just for their future, but for their right to stand together, side by side. The morning of the trial, the house was eerily quiet. June had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind filled with anxiety, her stomach twisted in knots. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about a piece of land or an inheritance. It was about her life with Garrett, the life they had begun to build together, and the love that had grown between them in the midst of so much pain. She hadn't realized just how much she had come to depend on Garrett until now, when the thought of losing him seemed unbearable. As she stood at the window, looking out at the land she had come to call home, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Garrett had been up early, preparing for the day, and now he was heading toward her. She felt a rush of emotion as she watched him approach on horseback, his face set in determination, his eyes focused on the task ahead. When he reached the front door, he dismounted quickly and walked toward her. His expression was hard, but his eyes held a depth of feeling she hadn't seen before. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the gravity of the day. Then, without a word, he took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. June nodded, though her throat was tight with fear. "I'm ready," she said, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together," Garrett said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. He kissed her forehead, then turned toward the door. "Let's go." The courthouse was a small, crowded place, the wooden beams and creaky floors echoing with the voices of the townspeople who had come to witness the trial. June felt the eyes of the room on her as she walked in, each pair of eyes filled with judgment. They had all heard the rumors, seen the whispers, and now they were here to watch her fate unfold. As she sat in the courtroom, she could feel the weight of their gaze upon her, the pressure mounting as the case began. Preston's lawyer was the first to speak, presenting a case built on the idea that the marriage was a sham, a mere arrangement with no true foundation. He argued that June's inability to give Garrett an heir rendered the marriage invalid, that she was nothing more than a placeholder, a temporary solution to a problem that had yet to be solved. Each word he spoke seemed to cut deeper, his accusations stinging like poison. June sat quietly, trying to steady her breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had never felt more alone, more exposed than she did in that moment. As the lawyer finished his argument, Preston stood up, his smug expression unwavering. He didn't look at her as he spoke, instead turning his attention toward Garrett. "This woman has no place in this family," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "She is not fit to carry on the Merritt name. She is a disgrace to this family. and we will not allow her to take what rightfully belongs to us." June felt the sting of his words deep in her chest, but it was Garrett's reaction that left her breathless. He stood up, his body tense with anger, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the man he had been hiding beneath the surface. His eyes were filled with fury, but they were also filled with something else, something more powerful than anger. It was love. "She is my wife," Garrett said, his voice ringing with authority. "And she is more than enough. She has given me something no one else could. Something real, something true. I don't need her to be anyone other than who she is. And I don't need anyone to tell me who I can love." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Garrett's voice was steady, unwavering, and as June looked at him, she saw not just the man she had come to love, but the man who would fight for her for them, no matter the cost. The lawyer tried to argue, but the room had already shifted. The town had seen something in Garrett's words that they hadn't seen before. They had seen the truth, the love between him and June. And for the first time, they were forced to confront their own judgments. When it was her turn to speak, June stood up slowly, her hands trembling as she faced the judge and the crowd. She had never spoken in public before, never had the courage to stand up for herself. But now, in this moment, she knew that she had to speak. She had to show them who she really was. "I am not broken," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "I'm not a placeholder. I'm a woman who has fought for everything she has. I am a woman who has been overlooked, underestimated, and judged, but I am not broken. I am stronger than that, and I am proud of who I am." Her words rang out in the quiet courtroom, and for the first time, she felt like she was being seen. She wasn't just the woman who had been sold at an auction. She wasn't just the woman who couldn't have children. She was June Merritt, and she had a place in this world, a place in this family. When the judge ruled in their favor, it was a victory, but it was more than just a legal win. It was a testament to their love, to their strength, and to the power of standing together in the face of adversity. Outside the courthouse, Garrett took her hand in his face full of pride and love. "We did it," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it together." And as they walked away from the courthouse, June knew that no matter what the world had thrown at them, no matter the obstacles they would face in the future, they would face it together. They had fought for their love, for their future, and they had won. And now, as they returned to their home, their life, and their future, June knew that she had finally found her place. She had found her home, not just in the house, but in Garrett's arms and in the love they had built together. And as they stepped into the future, hand in hand, she knew that the journey they had started was only just beginning.